He came to a forgotten town with nothing but worn hands and a dog that never left his side. Jake Miller was a soldier who survived war but could not escape the silence it left behind. All he wanted was a roof to fix and a place to sleep. But what if the ground beneath that church was still alive? What if the wind carried a memory that refused to die? And what if a loyal dog heard something no one else dared to hear? This is a story about lost faith community and the quiet miracle that happens when someone chooses to stay. May this story bring you comfort, hope, and a reminder that you are never truly alone. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. Jake Miller arrived in Cedar Ridge on a gray afternoon when the lake looked like a sheet of dull metal stretching to the edge of the world. He stepped down from an old bus that hissed and groaned before pulling away, leaving him alone on the roadside with a worn backpack and a heavy toolbox. The town did not greet him with noise or movement. It simply watched him in silence, as if deciding whether he belonged. Jake was about 40 years old, though time had treated him unevenly. His shoulders were still strong, shaped by years of carrying gear and lifting weight, but his posture carried the subtle bend of a man who had learned to brace for impact. His hands were thick and scarred, the skin rough and cracked, marked by heat, steel, and long hours of labor. They were the hands of a soldier who had survived war and returned to a life that offered no clear place to rest. Beside him stood Max, a German shepherd with a powerful build and calm amber eyes. His coat was dark along the back, fading into warm tan along his legs and chest. The dog stood close to Jake, not because he was afraid, but because that was where he chose to be. Max had once worn a vest and followed commands in places filled with dust, noise, and danger. Now he wore only a simple collar, but his awareness never faded. Jake paused and took in the air. It smelled of cold water, damp wood, and iron. Cedar Ridge was a small town pressed between forest and lake, worn thin by years of hard winters and fewer opportunities. Houses leaned slightly with age. Paint peeled from siding. A diner near the road flickered with a tired red sign that buzzed louder than it shone. This was not home. Jake no longer used that word easily. Home was something he once believed in, back when the future felt solid and predictable. War had changed that. Coming back had finished the job. Since leaving the service, Jake had lived a drifting life. He worked wherever his hands were needed: roofing, fences, old barns, abandoned houses. He slept in his truck when he had one, or in storage rooms and half-repaired buildings when he did not. Money came and went. Pain stayed. He sent what little he could toward old debts and expenses that never truly disappeared. There was no family waiting for him, no one calling to ask when he would settle down. The silence followed him everywhere, settling into his bones the way cold did. Max was the only thing that had stayed constant. The dog had been with Jake through deployments, long nights, and moments that neither of them ever spoke about. When Jake left the military, a chain of favors and paperwork allowed Max to come with him. Officially, the dog was too old for further service. Unofficially, Jake would never have walked away without him. They began walking through town. A few people glanced up from porches or paused near shop doors. Some nodded politely. Others simply watched. A man and a dog passing through did not raise many questions in a place like Cedar Ridge. Too many people had already passed through on their way out. The church sat at the edge of town, where the ground rose gently toward the lake. It was built of old timber, weathered gray by time and storms. The roof sagged slightly, moss clinging to the shingles like stubborn memory. A narrow steeple rose above the main structure, leaning just enough to suggest fatigue rather than collapse. Jake stopped at the base of the path leading up to it. He studied the building the way he once studied terrain, looking for weaknesses, looking for danger, looking for what time had done. Max sat beside him, eyes fixed on the church. His ears twitched at sounds Jake could not hear. Jake found the handwritten notice folded in his pocket and unfolded it again. Roof repair needed. Old church near the lake. Room and board offered. No promise of steady pay. It was enough. They climbed the gravel path together. The lake behind them shifted under the wind, waves brushing the shore with a low, steady sound that reminded Jake of engines heard through thick walls. The front door opened before Jake could knock. A woman stood there, small and straight-backed, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a simple covering. Her face was lined deeply, but her eyes were clear and steady. She wore plain dark clothing marked by dust and wear. Her hands were strong despite their age. "You must be Jake Miller," she said calmly. "Yes, Mom," Jake replied. She looked down at Max. "And this must be your dog." Max looked at her, then back at Jake, before settling into a relaxed sit. His tail tapped the ground once. "Good," she said. "We can use all the help we can get here." She introduced herself as Sister Ann and stepped aside to let them in. The church interior was cool and dim. Sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting pale shapes across wooden pews, worn smooth by decades of use. Dust floated in the air, slow and quiet, like time itself had learned to move carefully here. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. The silence inside was different from the quiet outside. It pressed inward, heavy and watchful. Sister Ann spoke simply. The church had been built long ago by people who no longer lived in Cedar Ridge. Many had moved away. Others had passed on. She stayed because someone needed to keep the place standing, even if only a few came through the doors anymore. She showed Jake a small room behind the chapel where he could sleep. A narrow bed, a wooden table, a window that looked out toward the lake. It was more than Jake expected. "You can eat with me," she said. "We do not have much, but it is warm." "That is enough," Jake said. She nodded, as if she understood he meant more than food. That evening, Jake unpacked his tools while Max explored the edges of the room before settling near the door. The dog circled once and lay down with his head on his paws, facing outward. Jake lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. His body ached in familiar ways, the kind of pain that never fully leaves. He closed his eyes and listened. The lake whispered outside. Wood creaked softly as the building cooled. Somewhere above him, wind moved along the roof. Max lifted his head. Jake opened his eyes. The dog stood and moved quietly toward the main chapel. His posture had changed. Focused. Alert. Jake followed. Moonlight spilled through the windows now, painting pale patterns across the floor. Max lowered his head near the altar, sniffing slowly. His body grew still. Jake felt it then. Not a sound, but a sensation. A faint vibration beneath his boots. Subtle. Steady. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the wooden floor. The vibration remained. Slow. Rhythmic. It reminded him of standing near heavy machinery before it started. That low, warning hum that told you something was moving, whether you saw it or not. Max looked at him and made a soft sound deep in his throat. Not fear, not aggression, a signal. "It is just the wind," Jake whispered, though he was not sure who he was trying to convince. They returned to the small room. Jake lay awake long after Max settled into steady breathing. Outside, the lake shifted under the night sky. Inside the church, something waited quietly beneath layers of wood and stone. Jake did not yet know that Cedar Ridge was not just a place to rest. It was a place where buried things began to stir. And Max had already heard the first whisper. Morning came slowly to Cedar Ridge. A pale light spread across the lake and crept through the narrow windows of the church. Jake woke before the bell of his body clock would have in other places. Years of service had trained him to rise before comfort could argue. His muscles ached as usual, the kind of ache that never fully fades but reminds a man that he is still here. Max was already awake. The dog stood near the door of the small room, ears angled forward, watching the thin line of light beneath the frame. When Jake sat up, Max turned his head and met his eyes. Calm, alert, waiting. Jake dressed quietly and stepped into the chapel. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of old wood and faint wax. Sunlight fell across the pews in long, soft bars. The place looked peaceful in daylight, almost fragile. It was hard to believe that anything unsettling could exist here. Sister Anne was already awake. She stood near the altar, sweeping the floor with slow, deliberate movements. Her back was straight despite her age. Her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath her simple covering. Every motion carried purpose, not haste. "Good morning," she said, without turning around. "Morning," Jake replied. She smiled faintly and rested the broom against the wall. "You sleep well." Jake hesitated. "Well enough," he said. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "The lake keeps its own hours," she said. "People learn to listen, or they leave." She poured coffee from an old pot and handed him a cup. It was strong and bitter. Jake accepted it gratefully. Sister Anne had lived here most of her life. She spoke of it plainly, as if it were no great sacrifice. She arrived when she was a young woman. Back then, Cedar Ridge was fuller. The church doors were rarely closed. Children filled the pews. Voices carried hymns out toward the water. Then the town began to thin. Jobs vanished. Families moved away. One by one, the houses emptied. Still she stayed. "Someone had to," she said. "Buildings like this do not ask for much, just attention, just presence." Jake understood that kind of loyalty. It reminded him of posts he had guarded long after the reason for guarding them had faded. The day passed with quiet work. Jake climbed onto the roof to inspect the damage. Several shingles were warped and loose. Moss had crept beneath the edges. Water stains marked the ceiling inside. It was honest work, the kind that let his hands stay busy, and his thoughts remain distant. Max stayed below most of the time. The dog moved slowly through the chapel, nose close to the floor, ears flicking at sounds Jake did not notice. Sister Anne watched him with interest, but did not interfere. "He listens deeply," she said. Jake glanced down at Max. He always has. By late afternoon, the sky darkened and a cold wind rose off the lake. Jake secured his tools and climbed down. Sister Anne prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread. They ate together at a small table in the back room. Conversation came easily, but lightly. Neither pushed for details. That night, the church settled into stillness again. Jake lay on the narrow bed, listening to the building breathe. Wood shifted. Wind pressed gently against the walls. Max lay near the door, as always. Then Max stood. Jake opened his eyes. The dog moved quietly into the chapel. His posture was different now. His tail was low, his steps careful. Jake followed him barefoot across the cold floor. Moonlight filled the space once more. Shadows stretched long and thin across the pews. Max stopped near the altar and stood still. His ears pressed forward. A low sound rolled in his chest. Not loud, not aggressive. A warning meant for someone who knew how to hear it. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Max lowered his head and pressed his ear against the stone floor. He shifted slightly, as if adjusting to catch something clearer. His growl deepened, but remained controlled. Jake crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The vibration returned. It was faint but undeniable. A low, steady movement beneath the stone. Not the rattle of wind through loose boards. Not the creak of old timber. It was slower, measured. Jake placed his palm against the floor. Cold stone met his skin. The sensation traveled up his arm. His mind reacted before his reason could catch up. Muscles tightened. Breath shortened. For a split second, he was back in another place, another ground, listening for danger that lived beneath the surface. He pulled his hand back sharply. "It is nothing," he muttered. "Just the wind. Old buildings make noise." Max did not move. The dog pressed his nose to the floor and let out a soft whine. His eyes flicked toward Jake and back again. Jake stood and rubbed his face with both hands. He had learned long ago that the mind can create patterns when it wants answers too badly. He had heard things that were not there before, felt threats that turned out to be shadows. This is just the past, he told himself. Old echoes. He placed a hand on Max's shoulder. "Easy, boy. We are safe." Max held his position for a long moment longer. Then slowly, he stepped back and followed Jake toward the small room. He lay down, but did not fully relax. His ears twitched through the night. Jake did not sleep easily. Memories pressed in. The sound beneath the floor blended with old noises he tried not to recall. He reminded himself that he was not in danger, that this was a quiet church in a quiet town, that nothing waited for him here. Still, the feeling lingered. Sometime before dawn, the vibration faded. Or maybe Jake simply stopped noticing it. Morning came again, with gray light and mist rising off the lake. Sister Ann moved through the chapel lighting candles. Jake watched her from a distance. He wondered how many nights she had listened to the same silence. At breakfast, she studied his face. "You heard it," she said calmly. Jake froze. He looked up slowly. Heard what? She met his eyes without flinching. "The building," she said. "It speaks sometimes." Jake said, "Nothing." She continued stirring her coffee. Most people do not notice. Or they notice and choose to forget. It is easier that way. Jake glanced toward Max. The dog sat at his side, alert but calm. "I thought it was just the wind," Jake said. Sister Ann smiled gently. "The wind has many voices," she replied, "some older than others." Jake did not know what to say. Outside, the lake rolled quietly against the shore. Inside the church, something old rested beneath stone and memory. Jake felt the edge of a truth he was not yet ready to face. He finished his coffee and stood. "I will start the repairs today," he said. Sister Ann nodded. "Thank you." As Jake walked back toward the roof, Max followed close at his heel. The dog glanced once more toward the altar before turning away. Whatever lay beneath Cedar Ridge had been heard, not by the town, not by the church, but by a soldier who no longer trusted his own peace, and by a dog who never ignored a warning. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm of work and quiet observation. Jake rose early each morning, before the lake finished shaking the mist from its surface. He ate a simple breakfast with Sister Anne and then climbed onto the roof with his tools while Max remained below. The work was slow and careful. Old shingles cracked easily. The wood beneath had softened in places from years of moisture and neglect. Jake replaced what he could and reinforced what remained. He worked with patience born from long experience. Rushing had never saved anyone. From the roof, he could see most of Cedar Ridge. A few houses tucked among trees, the diner near the road, the wide lake stretching endlessly beyond. It was a place that felt forgotten, but not empty. Something lingered here, not danger, not peace either. Something waiting. Below him, Max moved constantly. The dog paced the length of the chapel and returned again and again to the same spot near the altar. His steps were quiet, his posture alert. Each time he reached the area beneath the faded rug, his pace slowed. He sniffed carefully and lowered his head as if listening. Then he circled once and moved away, only to return minutes later. Jake noticed it by the third day. He paused on the roof and wiped sweat from his brow. He leaned over the edge and watched Max below through the open doorway. The dog stood still now. His ears were forward, his body tense. Jake climbed down. Inside the church, the air was cool and still. Dust hung lazily in the light streaming through the windows. Sister Anne knelt near the front pew, with her head bowed in silent prayer. She did not look up when Jake approached. Max stood near the altar again. Jake crossed the floor and crouched beside him. The rug beneath the dog paws was old and thin. Its edges were frayed. Max pawed lightly at one corner and then stepped back. Jake lifted the edge of the rug. Beneath it, the stone floor was cracked. A narrow line ran between two slabs, no wider than a finger. It was dark and uneven. Old. Jake frowned. He placed his palm flat against the stone. At first there was nothing, then he felt it. A faint vibration. Weak but steady. Slow and measured. It was not sound. It was movement. A pulse that traveled through the stone and into his skin. Jake pulled his hand away and sat back on his heels. The sensation stirred something deep and unwelcome. A memory of kneeling on foreign ground, of feeling vibrations through dirt and concrete, of knowing before anyone else that something was coming. His breath caught. Max watched him closely. The dog did not growl, did not bark. He simply waited, his eyes steady, trusting. Jake placed his hand on the stone again. The vibration continued, slow, even, almost like a heartbeat. Jake closed his eyes. For a moment, he was not in Cedar Ridge. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere loud and bright and broken. His body remembered before his mind could intervene. The tension in his shoulders, the way his pulse raced while the vibration beneath him stayed calm and patient. The understanding that ignoring it would be a mistake. He opened his eyes. This is not the same, he told himself. This is not a war zone. Still, the feeling remained. Jake stood and stepped back. He folded the rug carefully and laid it back into place. Max stayed where he was. Sister Anne rose quietly and approached. "You found it," she said. Jake turned toward her slowly. "Found what?" She looked down at the rug. Her face held no surprise, only recognition. "The place where the floor listens," she replied. Jake stared at her. "How long have you known?" She considered the question, long enough to learn when to ask and when to wait. She told him of nights when the church felt restless, of times when the air seemed heavier, of moments when the bell tower swayed even without wind. She never named it as fear. She called it awareness. Jake listened without interrupting. He did not tell her what the vibration reminded him of. Some comparisons stayed locked away for good reason. That afternoon, he climbed the bell tower to inspect the supports. The narrow stairs creaked beneath his weight. The air grew colder as he rose. From the top, he could see the lake glinting beneath the sun. The wind pressed gently against the structure, causing a low hum to travel through the beams. Jake paused. The sound carried downward. He felt it in his boots, in his legs. The vibration changed slightly, not stronger, clearer. He rested his hand against the wooden beam. The church was not silent. It was alive in its own way. When he descended, Max met him at the bottom of the stairs. The dog brushed against his leg and then turned back toward the altar. Jake followed. He knelt again and pressed his palm to the stone. The vibration felt familiar now. Not threatening. Not harmless either. His chest tightened with understanding. In the service, he had learned that ignoring instincts could cost lives. He had also learned that facing them meant accepting what they revealed. This place is telling something, he thought. He did not yet know what. That evening, he sat alone on the church steps, watching the lake darken as the sun sank low. Max lay beside him. The dog head rested on his paws, calm, present. Jake spoke quietly, more to himself than to Max. Some things do not go away just because we do not want to see them. Max lifted his head slightly, as if agreeing. Night fell gently over Cedar Ridge. The church settled around them. The vibration beneath the floor continued, soft, patient, waiting. Jake did not sleep much, but when he finally closed his eyes, he no longer told himself it was nothing. He knew better now. The decision to open the sealed hatch did not come quickly. Jake carried it with him through a full day of work on the roof and another quiet meal with Sister Ann. The thought sat heavy in his chest, steady and persistent, much like the vibration beneath the stone floor. By evening, he knew it would not leave him alone. They stood together near the altar as dusk crept in through the windows. The church felt different now, not threatening, expectant. Sister Ann knelt and folded the thin rug back with care. Beneath it lay the cracked stone Jake had seen before. She brushed dust from the surface with her sleeve, revealing a faint outline in the floor. A square shape. Old. Deliberate. Most people never notice it, she said softly, even when it is right beneath their feet. Jake studied the outline. His instincts stirred again. This was not a random flaw. It was a doorway. They worked slowly. Jake used a pry bar and hammer, careful not to fracture the surrounding stone. The metal groaned as it gave way. Dust rose in a pale cloud and drifted through the air. The stone slab shifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath. A rush of cold air escaped the opening. Jake paused. The air smelled different. Damp. Mineral. Like the inside of a cave. Max stepped forward before either of them spoke. His posture was steady, his ears forward, his tail low but calm. He did not hesitate. Jake clipped a small light to his belt and shined it downward. The beam revealed a narrow passage descending into shadow. Stone walls lined with old metal channels. Pipes curved gently along the sides, green with age. Sister Ann inhaled slowly. "It has been closed since before my time," she said. "They sealed it after the collapse." Jake glanced at her. Collapse. She nodded. A storm many decades ago. The ground gave way near the lake. Part of the old system failed. People were afraid. They sealed what they could and forgot the rest. Max moved forward and began descending carefully. His paws touched the stone with confidence born of experience. Jake followed close behind. Sister Anne remained above, holding the light steady. The tunnel sloped gently downward. The air grew cooler with each step. Water dripped somewhere ahead. The pipes overhead hummed faintly as wind from the lake pressed through unseen channels. Jake ran his hand along the wall. The stone was smooth in places, shaped by human effort long ago. This was no accident. This had been built. They reached a wider chamber where several tunnels met. The floor was uneven. Debris lay scattered along the edges. Old boards, rusted metal, fragments of cloth. Max stopped abruptly. He lowered his head and sniffed the ground. Then he moved toward a corner where the stone wall had partially collapsed inward. He pawed lightly and then froze. Jake knelt beside him and shined his light. Scratches marked the stone. Not random. Deliberate. Fingers or tools had scraped here again and again. Beside them lay a small pile of stones, arranged in a crude pattern. Jake felt his throat tighten. Someone had been here, he said quietly. Max sniffed deeper and let out a low sound. Not fear. Recognition. Jake followed the dog's gaze and spotted a rusted can tucked beneath a fallen beam. He lifted it carefully. Inside lay remnants of fabric, a scrap of paper pressed flat by time and moisture. The ink was faded but visible. A name, a date, decades old. Jake closed his eyes briefly. Someone had been trapped here, he said, and they tried to survive. The tunnel system stretched farther than Jake expected. One passage sloped toward the lake. He could hear water moving more clearly now. The pipes overhead widened and narrowed in places, guiding air through the earth like breath through lungs. This is how they kept the church dry, he realized. The wind from the lake pulled moisture away. It was alive once. Max led them carefully through the darkness. He navigated fallen stones and narrow turns with ease. At one point, he stopped and waited for Jake before continuing. Always checking. Always aware. They reached a point where the tunnel opened toward a collapsed exit. Moonlight filtered faintly through cracks above. Water pooled along the floor. Jake crouched and studied the area. The collapse had sealed the passage but left enough air movement to keep the tunnels breathing. Just barely. He imagined someone down here long ago. Injured. Waiting. Listening to the same hum Jake felt now. A weight settled over him. Sister Anne's voice echoed faintly from above. "Are you all right?" Jake looked back toward the opening. "Yes," he called, "but we are not alone." They returned slowly. Jake made note of everything he saw. The scratches, the can, the arrangement of stones, evidence not of myth, but of human struggle. When they climbed back into the church, the night air felt warmer despite the chill. Jake replaced the stone slab carefully and laid the rug back into place. Sister Anne sat on a nearby pew. Her hands rested in her lap. "The church has carried this for a long time," she said. "It does not forget those who suffered beneath it." Jake sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. Max lay at their feet, calm again, as if his job had been done for now. Jake understood something then. This place was not haunted. It was remembered. Whatever had been sealed away beneath Cedar Ridge had waited patiently, not for fear, not for belief, for someone willing to listen. And Max had listened first. The sound of unfamiliar engines reached Cedar Ridge just after midday. Jake heard it from the roof before he saw anything. A low, steady hum that did not belong to tractors or delivery trucks. It carried confidence, money, purpose. He climbed down slowly and wiped his hands on a rag. Max stood near the church steps, ears forward, body alert. A black vehicle rolled into view, followed by another. Clean lines, polished paint, tires that never touched mud unless someone planned it that way. They stopped near the edge of the gravel road. A man stepped out wearing a long coat and shoes too clean for Cedar Ridge. He was tall, with neatly trimmed gray hair, and a posture that suggested he was used to rooms quieting when he spoke. Two others followed him carrying folders and measuring equipment. Sister Anne emerged from the church doorway. The man smiled easily. "Richard Cole," he said, "I appreciate you meeting with me." His eyes moved past her and settled on Jake. They lingered just long enough to measure him. Work clothes, calloused hands, a dog at his side. "And you must be the repairman," he said. Jake did not answer right away. "Yes," Jake said finally. Richard Cole nodded politely. "I represent an investment group interested in this property. Cedar Ridge has potential. Lake access, privacy, history. We intend to develop a resort that will bring jobs and visitors back to this town." Sister Anne folded her hands calmly. "This church has stood here longer than any of us," she said. "It is not for sale." Richard smiled again, a patient smile. "Everything has a price, sister." Jake felt Max shift beside him. Richard turned to Jake. "You are here on temporary work, I assume. We will need the building cleared soon. I would suggest you finish up and move on. There will be compensation." Jake stared at him. "I was told I could stay here," Jake said. "Work for room and meals?" Richard shrugged lightly. "Arrangements change. We will handle matters from here." The words were polite. The message was not. That evening, Sister Anne sat with Jake at the small table. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "He has been coming for years," she said, "always polite, always certain." Jake leaned back in his chair. "He thinks this place is empty," Jake said. Sister Anne nodded. "People often mistake quiet for emptiness." That night, Jake could not sleep. The conversation replayed again and again. He had been seen as an outsider his whole life. This was nothing new. Move on. Make room. Disappear. Max rose quietly and moved toward the chapel. Jake followed. The church was dark, except for moonlight spilling through the windows. Max walked straight to the altar and lowered his head. He sniffed the rug and then turned toward Jake. Jake lifted the rug again. The stone slab lay beneath unchanged. The vibration was still there. Faint. Steady. Jake removed the slab once more and descended into the tunnel. Max went first without hesitation. The air below felt charged. The pipes hummed softly as wind pressed through them from the lake. Max led Jake deeper than before, past the chamber with the scratches, toward a narrower side passage Jake had not explored. The dog stopped and pawed at a section of collapsed debris. He sniffed intensely and then stepped back. Jake moved the stones carefully. His light caught the edge of metal, a box. Rust coated its surface. The hinges were stiff but intact. Jake pried it open slowly. Inside lay a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. Beside it were rolled papers tied with twine. Jake opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, but faded. Dates filled the margins. Descriptions of wind pressure, tunnel maintenance, notes about storms and repairs, names of workers assigned to different sections. One name appeared again and again. A man who had been listed as missing years ago. Jake swallowed. The journal told the story of a worker assigned to maintain the ventilation system, of storms growing stronger, of a collapse near the lake entrance, of being trapped, of rationing food and marking days by the sound of the wind through the pipes. The last entries grew unsteady. Still breathing, he had written. The wind still moves. If someone finds this, then the church remembers. Jake closed the journal slowly. The rolled papers were diagrams, hand-drawn maps of the tunnel system, airflow routes, pressure points, the very heart of how the church stayed dry and standing. This place was never abandoned, Jake whispered. It was sealed. Max sat beside him quietly. Jake felt anger rise, not loud, focused. Richard Cole did not see a church. He saw land, profit, silence to be replaced by noise. Jake climbed back to the surface and replaced the slab carefully. Sister Ann waited for him in the pews. He found something, did he not? She asked. Jake handed her the journal. She read silently. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. They buried more than stone, she said. They buried a man. Jake nodded. Outside, the lake wind rose and pressed against the walls. The church responded with a low hum, alive, resisting. Jake looked down at Max and rested his hand on the dog head. We are not leaving, he said quietly. Max lifted his gaze and held it. Whatever Richard Cole planned would not come easily. The church had waited too long. And now, it had been heard, the storm arrived without apology. It rolled across the lake in a wide, dark band that swallowed the horizon and pressed the air flat against the earth. By late afternoon, the wind had sharpened, and the water near the shore churned in restless circles. Jake felt it before the first rain fell, a pressure change deep in his chest. The same instinct that once told him when to brace. Max felt it too. The dog paced near the church doors, ears twitching, nose lifting toward the scent of rain and metal carried on the wind. His movements were controlled but urgent. He did not settle. Sister Ann stepped into the chapel and looked toward the windows. The trees beyond the glass bent low, their branches shuddering. This one will be strong, she said quietly. By evening, the first townsfolk arrived. A couple with a child wrapped in a blanket. An older man with a limp leaning heavily on a cane. Then more followed. Farmers, fishermen, people who knew that when storms came off the lake, the church was the safest place left standing. Jake helped them inside and closed the doors behind them. The wind howled around the building, rattling the windows and pressing hard against the walls. Rain struck the roof in heavy sheets. The church filled with low voices and nervous movement. Sister Ann moved calmly among them, offering reassurance with her presence more than her words. Max stood near the center aisle, watching everything. As the storm worsened, the air inside the church began to change. A low sound crept up from beneath the floor, barely noticeable at first, a hum that settled into the bones rather than the ears. Jake froze. He felt it again, the vibration. Stronger now, clearer. The ancient system was waking. Wind forced its way through the buried tunnels beneath the church, drawn in from the lake and pushed upward by pressure and temperature. Pipes hidden beneath stone carried air like breath through lungs, long thought dead. The sound deepened. It was not mechanical. It was organic. A slow, powerful rhythm that rose and fell like something alive. People noticed. "What is that?" someone whispered. Sister Ann closed her eyes briefly. "The church is breathing again," she said. Max barked. Once. Then again, sharp and insistent. The dog moved quickly toward the altar and began circling. His paws struck the stone floor in tight patterns. He barked again and lowered his head, pressing his nose close to the ground. Jake pushed through the gathering crowd and knelt beside him. "Easy boy," he murmured. But Max would not settle. He barked louder now and pawed at the stone near the rug. Jake placed his hand on the floor. The vibration surged suddenly. Then he felt it, a subtle shift beneath the stone, a soft sinking sensation. His blood went cold. "The ground is weakening," he shouted. Another gust slammed into the church and the hum rose sharply. Dust fell from the rafters. A few stones shifted near the altar. Jake stood fast. "Everyone move away from the front," he called. "Now." His voice carried authority without effort. People listened. Max barked again and ran toward the side aisle, stopping and looking back. He knew the path. He had already marked the safe ground. Jake followed and guided the others behind him. He kept one hand on Max's collar and used the other to usher people forward. The floor near the altar cracked with a dull sound. A narrow line split between stones and water seeped upward, dark and cold. The storm outside roared louder, as if answering the earth. "Move, keep moving," Jake said. Sister Anne stood firm near the pews, guiding the last few people toward the rear exit. Her face was calm but focused. As the final person cleared the area, a section of the floor collapsed inward with a heavy grinding sound. Stones dropped into the darkness below, and the hum surged once more before settling. Jake pulled Max back just in time. They reached the side room where the ground was solid and the walls thick. Rain battered the building, but the structure held. For several long minutes no one spoke. Then slowly, the hum softened. The wind outside remained fierce, but the vibration beneath the floor eased into a steady rhythm once more. The system adjusted, redirected, balanced. The church stood. Max finally sat down. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Jake knelt beside him and pressed his forehead briefly against the dog neck. "Good boy," he whispered. People began to murmur. Relief replaced fear. Some wiped tears from their faces. Others stared toward the altar in quiet awe. Sister Anne approached Jake. "You listened," she said simply. Jake nodded. He looked around at the people gathered here. Ordinary lives, bound together by chance and weather and an old wooden building that refused to let go. If Max had not warned him, if he had ignored the signs, the outcome would have been very different. The storm raged through the night, but the church remained standing. Wind roared through the hidden tunnels beneath the ground, carrying moisture away and easing pressure like it had once done long ago. By morning, the rain slowed and the sky lightened. The lake settled into a restless calm. People began to leave the church, thanking Jake and Sister Anne quietly. Some paused to kneel. Others simply touched the walls as they passed. Jake stood near the door, with Max at his side. He felt drained, but steady. The system beneath the church had spoken clearly now, not with fear, with force. And Max had heard it first. Jake understood something new. This was no longer just a job, or a place to sleep. This was a responsibility. Morning broke slowly over Cedar Ridge after the storm. The lake was calm again, its surface smooth and gray, as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But inside the church, the damage near the altar remained. Cracked stone, damp earth, a gap that breathed cool air upward in steady pulses. Jake stood at the edge of the collapsed section with Max at his side. The dog was alert but calm, his body angled toward the opening beneath the floor. He had not moved far from it since the storm ended. The townspeople gathered quietly behind them. No one pushed forward. No one joked or questioned. What they had heard and felt during the storm had stripped away disbelief. Something real lived beneath the church. Sister Anne stood near the front pew, her hands clasped tightly. Jake knelt and studied the opening. Stones had fallen away during the collapse, revealing part of the old tunnel system. The air flowing upward was cool and clean, carrying the faint sound of moving water. He remembered the journal, the careful notes, the man who had written that he was still breathing. Jake looked at Max. "Ready, boy," he said softly. Max stepped forward without hesitation. They lowered themselves carefully into the opening. Jake secured a rope around a solid beam above and tested his footing as he descended. Max moved ahead, sure and steady, his paws finding balance even in the dark. The tunnel smelled of damp stone and minerals. Water trickled along the floor in narrow channels. The hum of moving air surrounded them, quieter now, but constant. Jake shined his light ahead. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber than the ones he had seen before. The walls here were smoother, more deliberate. Pipes curved along the ceiling and vanished into the rock. Max stopped suddenly. His ears pressed forward. His tail lifted slightly. Jake froze. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it. Not wind, not water. Breathing. Slow, shallow, human. Jake moved forward carefully. In the far corner of the chamber lay a small enclosed space formed by fallen stone and reinforced beams. A pocket of air. Crude but intentional. Max moved closer and let out a soft whine. Jake shined the light inside. A man lay there. He was thin, his hair white and matted, his skin pale and drawn tight against bone, but his chest rose and fell. Alive. Jake swallowed hard. "Sir," he said gently, "can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, but aware. "You came," he whispered. His voice was barely sound. "The wind told me someone would come." Jake crouched beside him. "We are getting you out," Jake said. "You are safe now." The man tried to smile. "I knew it was still breathing," he said. "I kept listening." Jake worked quickly, but carefully. He checked for injuries. The man was weak, but conscious. He had survived on collected rainwater and a trickle of groundwater diverted through the old system. The ventilation had kept him alive. Barely. For years, beyond reason. Max stayed close. He pressed his body gently against the man's side and licked his hand once. The man looked at the dog. "Good boy," he murmured. With great effort, Jake secured the man into a harness. He signaled upward, and the rope tightened as people above began to pull. The ascent was slow. As they emerged into the church, the townspeople gasped. A hush fell over the room. Jake guided the man onto solid ground. Someone rushed forward with blankets. Another brought water. Sister Anne knelt beside him. "Welcome home," she said softly. The man looked around with unfocused eyes. The church, he whispered, still standing. "Because of you," Jake said. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, the entire town had gathered. People stared in disbelief as the old man was carried out into the light. Some recognized his face from faded photographs. Others whispered his name as if afraid it would vanish again. The missing worker. The one spoken of in rumors. The one whose story had become legend. Now breathing in front of them. Jake stood back with Max. He felt hollow and full at the same time. An ambulance arrived from the nearest town. The medics moved with urgency but amazement. They had never expected to find a living man beneath a church. As the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, the townspeople turned toward Jake. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. Another nodded with quiet respect. Sister Ann approached. "The church has been waiting for this," she said, "for the truth to rise." Jake looked down at Max. "He listened," Jake replied. Max wagged his tail once. The legend was gone now, replaced by breath and bone and undeniable life. Cedar Ridge would never forget this day, and neither would Jake. The weeks that followed changed Cedar Ridge in ways no one could have planned. The rescue beneath the church traveled beyond the town limits and reached ears that had long ignored this quiet place by the lake. Officials arrived. Engineers followed. Historians walked the tunnels with careful steps and quiet voices. They studied the old ventilation system and the way it still breathed with the wind from the lake. The conclusion was clear. The church was not abandoned. It was alive with history. The proposal to tear it down was withdrawn without ceremony. Richard Cole never returned. His plans dissolved into paperwork and silence. The town council voted unanimously. The church would be protected as a historical site. The tunnels beneath it would be preserved and stabilized. What had once been seen as an obstacle was now recognized as a legacy. Sister Ann stood in the chapel when the decision was announced. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. She closed her eyes for a long moment and let the relief settle into her bones. "It will breathe in peace," now she said. Jake stood beside her with Max at his heel. The next offer surprised him more than the storm or the rescue ever had. The council asked Jake to stay. They needed someone who understood the building, someone who respected it, someone who would listen when the wind spoke through old stone and wood. They offered him steady work, maintaining the church and overseeing repairs. They arranged a small house by the lake, modest but warm, a place with a porch that faced the water and a yard where Max could stretch his legs. Jake did not answer right away. For years he had lived ready to leave, ready to move on before something broke or demanded too much of him. Belonging had felt dangerous. Max made the decision for him. The dog walked out onto the porch of the little house and lay down in the sun as if he had always known this was where they would stop. Jake laughed quietly and shook his head. "All right, boy," he said. "We will stay." Life in Cedar Ridge found a new rhythm. Jake worked most days repairing shingles, reinforcing beams, and restoring parts of the ventilation system under careful supervision. He learned the tunnels the way others learned roads. The sound of moving air became familiar, comforting. Max followed him everywhere. The townspeople greeted the dog with smiles and gentle hands. Children sat beside him during services. Old men nodded at him with quiet respect. They called him the guardian. The bell rang again one clear morning, not from wind, not from pressure, but from a careful pull on a restored rope. The sound rose clean and strong across the lake. Jake froze when he heard it. His chest tightened. For a heartbeat, he was somewhere else, somewhere loud and burning. Then Max pressed against his leg. Jake looked down and breathed. The sound softened, changed. It was no longer an alarm, no longer a warning. It was a welcome. That night, Jake stood on his porch and watched the lake reflect the stars. Max lay beside him. The dog head rested on his paws. Peaceful, content. Jake thought of all the places he had slept over the years, all the doors he had passed through without looking back, all the silence he carried like armor. Here, the silence felt different. It did not press in. It opened outward. The church stood firm against the dark. Its windows glowed softly. The bell tower rose steady against the sky. Jake realized something then. He had not been wandering without purpose. Every step had led him here, to a place that needed listening more than strength, to a community that remembered, to a dog who never stopped guiding him forward. Max lifted his head and looked toward the church. The wind moved through the trees and carried a low, gentle sound through the night. The system beneath the earth breathed quietly, balanced, whole. Jake rested his hand on Max's back. "This is home," he said. Max closed his eyes. For the first time since leaving the war, Jake did the same without fear. This story is not only about an old church or a hidden tunnel beneath the earth. It is about people. It is about a man who thought he had nothing left to give and discovered that his presence alone could save a place and a community. It is about a dog whose loyalty and instincts became a bridge between fear and hope. And it is about a town that remembered who it was when it chose to listen instead of look away. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes, they come quietly through service, through courage, through choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. In everyday life, we are surrounded by chances to become part of something larger than ourselves. A neighbor who needs help, a memory that asks to be honored, a calling that waits patiently beneath the noise of the world. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on where you are being called to listen more closely. Share this story with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what gives you hope. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, kindness, and second chances. And may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and guidance in every season of life.